Hi everybody, this is Sandy. I'm doing my Pecha-Kucha on racism, more specifically systemic racism. The goal is that at the end of this presentation, we will understand it more and understand what we can do to help the problem. It's important to understand what systemic racism is. In our textbook, Ray explains how racism is much more and still deeply entrenched in culture and institutions than previously acknowledged. So that's a pretty good description. Understanding systemic racism is important because it allows us to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. For me personally, it allows me to become an ally and to do what I can to try to help. As Ray said, this is still very much in our lives and culture today. We recently saw what happened to Ralph Yarl by ringing on the wrong doorbell. So it's something that we're still seeing almost on a daily basis in America. Systemic racism can take many forms, but many people agree that it all starts in the education system. The concept of school of choice has caused lots of questions and animosity as to why people don't get the same advantages as other people. The concept of school of choice basically means that regardless of where you live, you should be able to choose the school that your children go to. This would mean that you would have to transport them to a different part of the area, but that they might get a better education. This may seem like a no-brainer, but there is some opposition as to whether people should be able to send their child to whichever school they decide. Some believe that this will negatively impact the public schools because people will have a choice to leave. Others think that it'll help. Either way, it's safe to say that waiting until college for affirmative action or diversity to help students, it would be much more beneficial if children could choose, or parents could choose for their children, a better school when they're younger so that they have more advantages later in life. So what does the Bible have to say about racism? Regardless of how you look at the Old Testament or the New Testament, the Bible makes it very clear that we are to treat everyone the same. Although there is conversation in the Old Testament about not marrying and breeding with other tribes and people outside, this is not because they are racist. This is to prevent idol worship and worshiping false gods. There are even laws written into the Old Testament that protect immigrants and people outside of the Israelite communities, asking the people to be welcoming and to feed them. In the New Testament, the Jews believed that they were elite, that they were above other races, but Jesus made it very clear that they would not get into heaven based on their bloodline, but on their faith. So how do we approach this ethically? Which perspectives should we use? I took the time to look at deontological, utilitarianism, and relativism in order to better understand how to approach this problem. First, we can look at this deontologically, or with divine command. This would have us consider what God would want us to do, doing whatever we think is the right thing through Him, which has been proven that systemic racism is not what God wants. Next, let's consider what it would be like if we looked at it from a utilitarianism mindset. This would be a very opposite thing because this considers the majority of people And unfortunately, those that are negatively impacted by systemic racism are typically the minority. Currently, I think that we approach this problem with relativism. This is the understanding that what is moral depends on the situation and culture decides what is right or wrong. I think that's what we're seeing with the protests and the people standing up against systemic racism. So, how do we fix the problem? What do we do to end systemic racism? There are a few things that we can do to approach it, but it starts with acknowledging the problem. We have to understand that systemic racism does exist. It's also important for white Caucasian people to understand the concept of white privilege and what it means to be white, what barriers that we don't have to cross that other people may have to. It's important that we understand that it is a real thing. It's also important to understand our own unconscious biases. We should reflect on how we perceive other cultures. We should reflect on what assumptions we make of other people and reflect on how do our beliefs affect our decision making. Finally, we need to understand the history. We need to look back and see how other cultures have been treated and what we can do to change that. It's important to know that these things do exist and that we have control on how we treat other people.